The moment I stepped onto the training floor, I knew Officer Ven had already decided how this day would end. Her eyes locked onto me before I even reached the marked line, and there was something in that stare that felt less like evaluation and more like a verdict already written. My name is Ethan Cole. I was one of 40 cadets selected from Earth to join the Coalition Fleet Academy, the first joint training program that allowed humans to stand beside pilots, engineers, and soldiers from a dozen other worlds. We were told this was history. We were told this was an honor. What nobody told us was how many of those other worlds saw us as an experiment that had gone slightly too far. The academy itself sat inside a massive rotating station above a quiet blue moon, far from Earth, far from anything familiar. Long metal corridors stretched in every direction, lined with viewports that looked out onto stars none of us had names for yet. The gravity plating hummed under our boots every morning, a constant reminder that we were guests in someone else's house, following someone else's rules. Humans were the newest species in the Coalition. We had only been part of this alliance for 6 years, ever since our world was contacted following a small trade dispute between two larger empires that happened to pass near our solar system. Earth was not chosen because we were powerful. We were chosen because we were convenient, sitting at a strategic crossroad of travel lanes. Many species in the Coalition never let us forget that detail. At the Academy, this meant most instructors and senior cadets treated us the way you might treat a nervous new student who transferred in halfway through the year. Some were polite, some were curious. A few were openly hostile, believing our species had no place among warriors who had been shaping their military traditions for thousands of years before our ancestors had even discovered fire. Officer Draxa Ven belonged to that last group, and she made sure everyone knew it. Ven was Veltheron, a species known across the galaxy for their discipline, their towering height, and their long history of combat excellence. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, with pale gray skin marked by faint blue lines that pulsed slightly when she was angry, which seemed to be most of the time. She had served in 3 border conflicts before becoming an instructor, and her uniform carried more medals than any other officer on this station. She had earned her reputation, and she made sure every cadet remembered that fact daily. She also made sure every human cadet remembered we had earned nothing yet. That morning, as I walked toward the sparring circle, drawn in bright yellow light on the floor, I felt the weight of dozens of eyes from different species settle on me. Cadets from the Crossic warrior clans, easily identified by their thick armored shoulders. Slender Farai cadets, with quick reflexes and quicker tongues. A few of my fellow humans, including my closest friend at the Academy, Liam Turner, who gave me a small nod from the sidelines, trying to offer some quiet support. Officer Ven stood at the center of the circle, arms folded behind her back, her posture perfectly still in the way only someone who has spent a lifetime in discipline can achieve. She watched me approach without a single change in expression. "Cadet Cole," she said, her voice carrying easily across the hall, deep and slow, each word chosen with precision. "Step forward." I stepped forward. This was supposed to be a routine evaluation, part of our mixed species combat training program. Each week, instructors paired cadets from different worlds to demonstrate technique, not to fight seriously, but to learn from each other's style. It was meant to build understanding between species who might one day serve together on the same ship, in the same crew, trusting each other with their lives. Ven had other plans for what today's lesson would be. "Your species," she said, turning slightly to address the entire room rather than just me, "has been part of this coalition for 6 years. In that time, you have contributed exactly 1 technological innovation of note, and you required assistance to develop even that. Yet here you stand, in this academy, training beside warriors whose bloodlines have fought across 100 worlds." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through some of the watching cadets. Not all of them, but enough. I kept my hands at my sides and my expression calm. We had been warned, repeatedly, during our orientation weeks, that human cadets were expected to demonstrate exceptional discipline, precisely because so many eyes were watching us, waiting for a single mistake to justify pulling our species from the program entirely. I had promised myself I would not be that mistake. "I understand the concern, officer," I said, keeping my voice even. "I'm here to learn, same as everyone else." Vin's pale eyes narrowed slightly. Something about my calm response seemed to irritate her more than if I had argued. "Learn," she repeated, testing the word like it tasted strange in her mouth. "Your species learns quickly. I will grant you that. You learn to imitate. You learn to follow instructions. But combat is not imitation, Cadet. Combat requires instinct built over generations. What instincts does your short, fragile species carry into this circle?" I felt my jaw tighten, but I said nothing. Around us, more cadets had gathered, drawn by the rising tension in Vin's voice. I noticed Threk Molvar, a Crossic cadet who had never been unkind to me, watching with a concerned expression. I noticed Senik Dor, a Veltheron cadet close to Vin's own bloodline, smiling slightly, clearly enjoying the show. "With respect, officer," I said, "I believe the purpose of today's exercise is technique demonstration, not combat." "Is it?" Vin asked, tilting her head. "Then perhaps you should demonstrate for us what technique your species brings to this floor. Show me your instincts, Cadet, or admit you have none worth showing." The room grew quieter. I understood what she was doing. She wanted a reaction. She wanted me to raise my voice, to argue, to give her a reason to report me for insubordination, proof that humans lack the discipline required for this program. I refused to give her that. "I'll demonstrate whatever technique you assign, officer," I said simply. For a moment, something flickered across her face, something between disappointment and renewed determination. She had wanted a fight born from anger. I had given her calm obedience instead. She would need to try harder. "Very well," she said. "Basic defensive stance. Show me." I moved into position, feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent, hands raised in the guard position taught to us during our first month at the academy. It was simple. It was correct. Vin circled me slowly, studying my stance the way a predator studies prey it has not yet decided to approach. "Adjust your elbow," she said. "Lower." I adjusted it. "Your weight is uneven," she said. "Fix it." I fixed it. She continued this way for several minutes, offering correction after correction, each one delivered with a slight edge of contempt, as though she expected me to fail at even the simplest instruction. I did not fail. I adjusted every time, calm, precise, controlled. Around the room, I noticed a shift in the mood. Some cadets who had been smiling earlier now watched with quiet curiosity, surprised perhaps that I had not yet cracked under the pressure. This seemed to bother Vin more than anything else. "Your stance is adequate," she finally said, though the words came out reluctantly, as if she resented admitting it. "Adequate is not exceptional. Adequate does not survive real combat." "I understand, officer," I said. "Do you?" she asked, stepping closer, close enough now that I had to look up slightly to meet her eyes. "I do not think you understand at all, Cadet. I do not think your species understands what real danger feels like. You have never faced true combat. You have never faced an opponent who does not care whether you live or die." I held her gaze and said nothing. The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. Somewhere behind me, I heard Liam shift his weight, clearly uneasy with how this evaluation had turned from routine training into something closer to a public trial. Vin studied me a moment longer, then stepped back, finally breaking the tension. "Return to the observation line," she said. "We will proceed to the next cadet." I nodded once and stepped back, feeling the tightness in my shoulders slowly ease as I moved away from the circle. I told myself the worst was over. I told myself I had passed her test simply by refusing to give her a reaction. I was wrong. As I turned to walk toward the sidelines, I felt the air behind me shift, a subtle displacement that some instinct buried deep in my mind recognized before my conscious thoughts caught up. Later, I would try to explain to others how I knew, how some part of me sensed movement before it fully happened, but in that moment there was no time for explanation. There was only reaction. Officer Venn had decided that adequate discipline was not enough of a lesson for the room to remember. She wanted something more permanent, something the other cadets would talk about for weeks, a moment that would prove, once and for all, that humans did not belong among true warriors. She struck first, and in the fraction of a second between her decision and her movement, something inside me simply took over, something built from years of training long before I ever left Earth, something that did not need permission or thought or hesitation. The room around me seemed to slow, sounds fading into a strange, distant hum, as every instinct I carried rose to meet the moment Venn had chosen to create. Whatever she expected to happen next, I do not think it was this. Her arm came around in a wide arc, aimed at the side of my head, a strike meant to knock a cadet to the floor in front of the entire room. It was fast. For a being her size, it was faster than it had any right to be. But speed alone does not win when someone has already read your intention a half-second before you commit to it. My body moved before my mind had fully processed what I was doing. I dropped my weight low and turned my shoulder into the space where her strike was heading, letting her arm pass just above me instead of meeting it directly. I felt the wind of her motion brush across my hair, close enough that I understood exactly how much force had been behind it. If that strike had landed, I would have been on the floor before I even realized I had been hit. It did not land. As her arm continued past me, carried forward by her own momentum, I reached up and caught her wrist with both hands. I did not try to stop her strength directly. Nobody trained properly would ever try to match raw power against raw power when the size difference was this extreme. Instead, I guided her arm further along the path it was already traveling, adding just enough pressure at the wrist to pull her balance forward and down. For a creature nearly 7 feet tall, balance is not a small thing to lose. The moment her weight shifted past the point her legs could correct for, her entire body followed the direction I had guided her arm toward. I stepped to the side, keeping her wrist locked at an angle that offered her no leverage to pull away, and let her own forward motion do the rest of the work. She hit the floor hard. I want to be honest about what happened next, because in the retellings that spread through the academy over the following days, some cadets exaggerated the moment into something far more dramatic than it actually was. There was no dramatic slam. There was no violent finish. The moment Venn's back met the mat, I released her wrist immediately and stepped back, hands open at my sides, showing clearly that the exchange was finished. The entire sequence had taken perhaps 3 seconds. For a long moment, nobody in the room moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the quiet hum of the station's gravity, plating beneath our feet, and the distant echo of Venn's breath as she lay on the mat, staring up at the ceiling, clearly trying to process what had just happened to her. I stood perfectly still, unsure what to do next. Every instinct told me to remain calm, to avoid any expression that might be read as pride or mockery. This was not a moment to celebrate. If anything, my chest felt tight with worry about what consequences might follow from an officer being put on the ground by a cadet, regardless of who had struck first. Venn sat up slowly, her pale skin flushed slightly darker along the blue lines that marked her temples, a physical sign among her species that usually indicated strong emotion. She looked at me, and for just a moment, before her expression hardened back into its usual composed authority, I saw something unfamiliar cross her face, something that looked almost like disbelief. "You will explain yourself, Cadet," she said, rising to her feet with the same rigid discipline she always carried, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Officer," I said carefully, keeping my tone respectful. I reacted to defend myself from an unscheduled strike. I did not initiate contact. Around the room, I could feel the shift in atmosphere as clearly as a change in temperature. Cadets who had been smiling earlier at Venn's mockery now stood in stunned silence, glancing between the two of us as though trying to reconstruct the sequence of events in their minds. Liam, standing near the observation line, had both hands pressed against his mouth, clearly torn between shock and the urge to celebrate. Threk Molvar, the Crossic cadet who had shown me quiet kindness before, stepped forward slightly, his heavy shoulders squared in a posture I recognized from our training as a sign of formal attention. "Instructor," he said carefully, addressing Ven directly. "With respect, the strike came from your position first. Several of us observed it clearly." Ven turned toward him sharply, her composure cracking just slightly at the edges. "This is not your concern, Cadet." "It became my concern the moment it happened in front of the entire training class," Threk replied, his voice steady despite the obvious risk of challenging an instructor directly. For a moment, I thought Ven might argue further, might try to reshape the story before it had a chance to spread. But something in the room had already shifted beyond her control. Too many cadets had witnessed the exchange clearly. Too many species with different customs around honesty and combat conduct had seen the same sequence of events unfold in the same 3 seconds. She straightened her uniform, smoothing down the fabric with sharp, controlled movements, clearly trying to reclaim some sense of authority over a situation that had spiraled far outside anything she had planned. "This session is concluded," she announced to the room, her voice carrying less certainty than it had at the start of the class. "Return to your quarters. We will address today's events through proper channels." The cadets began filing out slowly, many of them glancing back toward me with expressions I struggled to read. Some looked impressed, some looked confused. A few, particularly among the Veltheron cadets loyal to Ven's reputation, looked openly resentful, as though I had somehow committed an offense simply by defending myself successfully. As the room emptied, Liam finally broke away from the departing crowd and jogged over to where I stood, still trying to process everything that had just happened. "Ethan," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure Ven had already left through the far door, "do you understand what you just did?" "I defended myself," I said, though even as I said it, I could hear how insufficient those words felt for describing what had just occurred. "You put a decorated Veltheran combat officer on the floor in 3 seconds, Liam said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and quiet excitement, "in front of the entire evaluation class. Do you have any idea how that's going to look by tomorrow morning?" I did not have an answer for him. My mind was still replaying the moment over and over, trying to understand how my body had reacted with such precision, such calm control, when every rational part of me had expected fear or hesitation instead. The truth was, years before I had ever applied to the Coalition Fleet Academy, I had spent much of my early life training in disciplined martial arts back on Earth, encouraged by my family, who believed strongly in the value of controlled physical training paired with mental discipline. Later, during my military preparation before selection, that training had only deepened, shaped by instructors who emphasized precision over aggression, control over anger. I had never expected any of that training to matter here, surrounded by species who had spent millennia developing combat traditions across 100 different worlds. I had assumed, quietly, privately, that whatever skill I carried from Earth would seem small and insignificant compared to what these other cadets had grown up learning. Officer Ven's strike, and the 3 seconds that followed it, had proven that assumption wrong in front of the entire class. As Liam and I walked together toward the corridor leading back to our quarters, I noticed Threk Mulvar waiting near the doorway, apparently having stayed behind rather than leaving with the rest of the cadets. "Cadet Cole," he said as we approached, his deep voice carrying a note of genuine respect I had not heard directed toward me before. "What you did in there was well executed, controlled, no unnecessary force. Among my people, that kind of discipline earns real respect." "Thank you," I said, still feeling slightly unsteady from the adrenaline that had not yet fully left my system. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I was just trying to avoid getting hit. Threk's heavy features shifted into something that might have been amusement. "You avoided getting hit quite thoroughly, Cadet." Despite everything, I found myself almost smiling at that. "What happens now?" I asked, looking between Threk and Liam, uncertain what consequences might follow from an instructor being embarrassed in front of an entire evaluation class. Threk's expression grew more serious. "Officer Ven will likely report the incident to the Academy Commandant, framing it in whatever way best protects her position. Several of us witnessed the truth clearly, but truth does not always carry the same weight as rank within certain traditions. That thought settled uncomfortably in my chest as we continued walking. I had spent months trying to prove that human cadets belonged in this program through quiet discipline and careful behavior. I had avoided arguments, avoided provocations, followed every rule precisely as instructed. Now, despite doing exactly what our training required of me, I found myself facing the possibility of serious consequences simply because the person I had defended myself against outranked me significantly. "Don't worry," Liam said, though his voice carried more hope than certainty. "The Academy has sensor recordings of every training session. If this goes to any kind of formal review, the evidence will show exactly what happened." I wanted to believe him. But as we reached the corridor leading toward our separate quarters, and Threk offered a final respectful nod before departing toward the Crossic housing section, I could not shake the growing feeling that today's events had only just begun, and that whatever followed would determine far more than just my own standing at this academy. It would determine how an entire species new to this alliance would be perceived by everyone else within it. The summons came the next morning, delivered through the small communication panel beside my bunk while I was still lacing my boots. A flat mechanical voice informed me that Cadet Ethan Cole was required to appear before the Academy Review Board at the 9th hour station time, regarding an incident during yesterday's combat evaluation session. I read the message twice, my stomach tightening with each word, then set the panel down and finished dressing in silence. Liam met me outside my quarters, his expression carefully neutral in a way that told me he was trying not to show how worried he actually was. "Whatever happens in there," he said as we walked toward the administrative wing of the station, "remember that half the room saw exactly what happened. You're not walking in there alone, even if it feels that way." I appreciated the sentiment, though it did little to ease the tightness in my chest. The administrative wing looked different from the training areas of the academy, quieter, more formal, with polished metal walls that reflected our own nervous reflections back at us as we walked. Officers from several species passed us in the corridor, most offering only brief glances, though a few paused just long enough to study my face, clearly having already heard some version of yesterday's events through whatever channels carried gossip across a station this size. The review chamber itself was a wide circular room with a raised platform at its center, where 3 high-ranking officers sat behind a long curved desk. I recognized Commander Elias Frost immediately, the senior human liaison officer assigned to oversee our species' integration into the academy. Beside him sat a Farai officer with quick, sharp eyes, and at the center, occupying the highest seat, sat the academy commandant herself, a Veltharan officer named Kessa Vorn, whose reputation for strict fairness was well known among every cadet regardless of species. Officer Ven stood already positioned near one side of the platform, her posture rigid, her expression carefully composed into something resembling calm professionalism. When I entered, her eyes flicked toward me briefly, before returning to some fixed point straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge me directly. "Cadet Cole," Commandant Vorn said, her voice carrying the same measured authority I had heard described by other cadets who had faced her judgment before. "You are here regarding an incident that occurred during yesterday's mixed species combat evaluation. Please stand at the designated marker." I moved to the marked position on the floor, standing straight, hands clasped behind my back in the formal posture we had been taught during orientation. "Officer Ven has submitted a report," Vorn continued, glancing briefly at a data panel in front of her, stating that during a routine defensive demonstration, you responded with excessive and unauthorized physical force against a superior officer, resulting in her being thrown to the ground in front of the evaluation class. My chest tightened at the phrasing, excessive and unauthorized force. Those words painted a very different picture than what I remembered happening in that training hall. "Commandant," I said carefully, keeping my voice steady despite the nervous energy building inside me. "With respect, I would like the opportunity to explain the sequence of events as I experienced them." "You will have that opportunity," Vorn said. "But first, we will review the recorded sensor data from the training hall, as is standard procedure in any incident involving physical contact between cadets and instructors. A soft chime sounded, and the wide display screen behind the officers flickered to life, showing a clear overhead view of the training hall from the previous day. I watched myself standing in the sparring circle, watched Ven circling me slowly, offering her sharp corrections, watched the tense exchange of words that had built steadily toward the moment neither of us could take back. The room remained silent as the recording played forward, every cadet and officer present watching the same sequence unfold on the screen exactly as it had happened in reality. There was no ambiguity in the footage. Ven's arm moved first, a clear, deliberate strike aimed directly at my head, faster and more forceful than anything resembling a controlled training demonstration. My response followed less than a second later, smooth and economical, redirecting her momentum rather than meeting it with resistance, guiding her safely but firmly to the mat. When the recording paused on the final frame, showing Ven seated on the floor and myself standing several steps back with open, non-threatening hands, the silence in the chamber stretched uncomfortably long. Commandant Vorn studied the frozen image for a long moment before turning her attention toward Ven. "Officer," she said, her voice carrying a noticeably cooler edge than before, "your report described this cadet's actions as unauthorized aggression. The recorded footage appears to show a different sequence of events. Would you care to clarify?" Ven's posture stiffened further, though she kept her composure admirably under the pressure of the moment. "Commandant, the strike was intended as an unscheduled test of the cadet's reflexes under sudden pressure, a common evaluation technique used throughout Veltharan training traditions. The cadet's response exceeded the appropriate defensive measure required for such a test." I felt a flash of frustration at the explanation, though I kept my expression neutral. It was a careful answer, technically plausible, framed just enough to shift blame back toward my reaction rather than her initial action. I glanced toward Commander Frost, who was watching the exchange with narrowed eyes, clearly unconvinced. "Cadet Cole," Vihorn said, turning back toward me, "were you informed in advance that this sudden test would occur during yesterday's session?" "No, Commandant," I said honestly. "I was not informed of any planned test involving physical contact. My understanding of the session was that it involved stance correction and technique evaluation only." "And your response to the unexpected strike," Vorn continued, "was this response consistent with standard defensive training provided to human cadets at this academy?" "Yes, Commandant," I said. "The technique I used was a basic redirection maneuver, taught during our first month of combat instruction. I applied minimal force necessary to neutralize the immediate threat and released contact as soon as the threat was addressed." Vorn nodded slowly, studying the paused image on the screen once more before addressing the room at large. "Several additional cadets present during yesterday's session have submitted independent statements," she said, gesturing toward a second officer who stepped forward carrying a data slate, including Cadet Threk Malvar of the Krossic delegation, whose account aligns precisely with the recorded footage. I felt a small measure of relief at hearing Threk's name mentioned, grateful that he had followed through on submitting his account despite the obvious risk involved in directly contradicting a superior officer's version of events. Officer Ven remained silent, her jaw tightening slightly as the weight of the evidence continued building against her initial explanation. Commandant Vorn leaned back slightly in her seat, folding her hands together as she considered the situation for a long, quiet moment. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried the calm finality of someone accustomed to delivering difficult judgments. "Based on the sensor recording and corroborating witness statements," she said, "this board finds that Officer Ven initiated unscheduled physical contact without proper authorization or advance notice to the cadet involved. Cadet Cole's response falls within acceptable parameters of defensive training and does not constitute excessive force." A quiet exhale escaped me, though I kept my posture disciplined and controlled, aware that the review was not yet finished. "Officer Ven," Vorn continued, turning her full attention toward the instructor, Your report to this board contained a mischaracterization of events that conflicts directly with recorded evidence. This is a serious matter, particularly given the sensitivity surrounding our Academy's ongoing integration of new species into this program. You will be placed under formal review regarding both the incident itself and the accuracy of your submitted report. Ven's composure finally cracked, just slightly, a flicker of something between anger and disbelief crossing her features before she forced her expression back into rigid neutrality. "Understood, Commandant," she said, her voice tight. "Cadet Cole," Vorn said, turning back toward me, "you are cleared of any wrongdoing in this matter. You may return to your regular training schedule." "Thank you, Commandant," I said, relief washing through me even as I maintained careful composure in front of the assembled officers. As the review concluded and cadets began filing out of the chamber, I caught sight of Commander Frost approaching me directly, something I had not expected given his senior position within the Academy hierarchy. "Cadet Cole," he said, his voice quieter now that we were away from the formal proceedings. "That was well handled, both yesterday and today. Do you understand the significance of what just happened in there?" "I understand I avoided serious consequences," I said honestly. "Beyond that, I'm not entirely certain, sir." Frost allowed a small, knowing smile to cross his face. "This academy has been quietly testing how far certain instructors would push the boundaries with our species, watching to see whether human cadets could maintain discipline under provocation, and whether the broader coalition leadership would take reports of misconduct against us seriously. What happened yesterday, and how it was resolved today, sends a message far beyond this training hall." I considered his words carefully, beginning to understand the broader implications of everything that had unfolded over the past 2 days. This had never simply been about one instructor's personal contempt toward one cadet. It had been a test case, whether anyone had planned it that way or not, for how seriously the coalition would treat humans within its ranks going forward. "What happens to Officer Ven now?" I asked. "That will depend on the outcome of her formal review," Frost said. "But I suspect her reputation among her own people will suffer considerably, regardless of the official outcome. Veltharan culture places enormous value on both combat discipline and personal honesty. She has now been shown to have failed at both, in front of witnesses from multiple species." As Frost walked away, leaving me alone in the now mostly empty chamber, I found myself reflecting on just how quickly everything had changed since that quiet moment yesterday morning when I had simply walked toward a training circle, expecting nothing more than a routine evaluation. I had no idea, standing there in that empty review chamber, just how far word of this incident would eventually travel, or how many people across the wider coalition would soon be discussing the human cadet who had ended a fight in 3 seconds without a single unnecessary movement. By the time I reached the dining hall that evening, it was clear the story had already spread well beyond the cadets who had witnessed it firsthand. Conversations quieted slightly as I walked past certain tables, then resumed in hushed tones the moment I passed. A few cadets from species I had barely spoken to before offered small nods of acknowledgement as I found my usual seat beside Liam. "You're famous," Liam said, sliding a tray across the table toward me with a slight grin. "Well, infamous, depending on who you ask." "I didn't do anything except avoid getting hit," I said, though I could feel the exhaustion of the day settling into my shoulders. "That's not how the Farai cadets are telling it," Liam said, gesturing subtly toward a nearby table where several slender, quick-eyed cadets were deep in animated conversation, occasionally glancing in my direction. "According to them, you disarmed a Veltharan combat officer using nothing but her own strength against her, without throwing a single strike of your own." "That's actually accurate," I admitted. "Right, but the way they're describing it makes it sound like something out of an ancient legend," Liam said. "Give it another day, and people will be saying you did it blindfolded." Despite the exhaustion weighing on me, I found myself laughing quietly at that, grateful for a small moment of normal conversation after the tension of the review chamber earlier that day. Over the following week, I noticed the shift in how other cadets treated me, subtle at first, then increasingly obvious. Crossic cadets, known throughout the academy for respecting demonstrated skill above almost anything else, began greeting me with the same formal nod they typically reserved for cadets who had proven themselves in some meaningful way. Threk Molvar, in particular, made a point of sitting with Liam and me during meals several times that week, engaging in long conversations about training philosophy, technique, and the differences between human and Crossic approaches to combat discipline. "Your species values control above raw power," Threk observed during one such conversation, turning a piece of food slowly between his thick fingers as he considered his words carefully. "This is unusual. Most warrior traditions I have studied emphasize dominance, overwhelming force, proving strength through direct confrontation. Your approach seems to value patience and precision instead." "I think it depends on the person," I said. "Not every human fights the same way, but the training I received back on Earth focused heavily on using an opponent's own energy against them, rather than trying to overpower them directly." "A wise philosophy," Threk said, nodding slowly. "Among my people, we call this understanding your enemy's weight before you understand your own strength. It seems your instructors taught you something similar, even without the same words to describe it." Not every reaction across the academy was positive, however. Senek Dor, the Veltharan cadet closely aligned with Officer Ven's reputation, made his displeasure known clearly whenever our paths crossed in the corridors. He never confronted me directly, perhaps aware that doing so might invite the same kind of formal scrutiny that had already damaged Ven's standing, but his cold stares and pointed comments to other cadets within earshot made his feelings obvious enough. "It was luck," I overheard him say to a group of fellow Veltharan cadets one afternoon as I passed through the training wing. "The human got fortunate with timing, nothing more. Officer Ven simply underestimated how far the creature would go to save face in front of witnesses." I chose not to respond, remembering the lesson I had learned from Ven's own provocation days earlier. Reacting to every dismissive comment would only prove exactly the point certain cadets wanted to make about human cadets lacking discipline. Instead, I focused on my training, attending every scheduled session with the same quiet consistency I had maintained since arriving at the academy. News of Officer Ven's formal review, meanwhile, continued developing through official channels I had limited visibility into directly, though Commander Frost occasionally shared updates during our scheduled check-in meetings, mindful of maintaining appropriate confidentiality around the ongoing process. "The review board has confirmed the initial findings," Frost told me during one such meeting, roughly 10 days after the original incident. "Officer Ven has been formally reprimanded for both her conduct during the training session and the inaccuracies in her subsequent report. She retains her instructor position for now, though her authority over mixed species evaluations has been significantly reduced pending further review." "How is she handling that?" I asked, genuinely curious despite everything that had happened between us. "Poorly, from what I understand," Frost said, a note of something almost sympathetic entering his voice despite the circumstances. "Veltharan culture places tremendous weight on both reputation and honesty. Being formally reprimanded for dishonesty, in addition to losing a physical confrontation in front of witnesses, represents a significant blow to her standing among her own people, regardless of how the wider coalition views the incident." I considered this information carefully. Despite everything Ven had said and done, I found myself feeling less satisfaction than I might have expected at hearing about her professional difficulties. My goal had never been to damage her career or reputation. I had simply wanted to avoid being struck, and to do so without causing unnecessary harm in the process. "Do you think she'll try to retaliate somehow?" I asked, unable to fully shake a lingering unease about how this situation might continue developing. Frost considered the question seriously before answering. "Officially, any attempt at retaliation would result in immediate and severe consequences, given the scrutiny now surrounding her conduct. Unofficially, I would recommend continued vigilance. Wounded pride sometimes finds ways to express itself that fall outside official channels." That warning stayed with me over the following days, though nothing immediately troubling occurred. Ven continued her instructor duties, though I noticed she avoided directly engaging with human cadets whenever possible, redirecting her attention instead toward other species during group training sessions. When our paths did cross in shared corridors or dining areas, she offered nothing beyond cold, formal acknowledgement, a stark contrast to the open contempt she had displayed during our first significant interaction. Meanwhile, word of the incident continued spreading well beyond the boundaries of our particular training class. I began noticing cadets from entirely different sections of the academy, ones I had never directly trained alongside, offering curious glances or quiet nods of acknowledgement as I moved through common areas. Some approached directly, asking questions about human combat philosophy, training methods, or simply curious about what had actually happened during that now widely discussed evaluation session. One such conversation occurred during a shared engineering workshop with Grace Bennett, a fellow human cadet who had transferred into a different training track shortly after our initial arrival at the academy. "Everyone keeps asking me about it," Grace said, adjusting a component on the workstation between us as we worked through a shared assignment. "Like I have some special insight just because I'm also human." "What do you tell them?" I asked. "Mostly that I don't know any more than what everyone else has already heard," Grace said, laughing softly. "Though I did tell one particularly persistent Farai cadet that all humans receive secret combat training before leaving Earth, just to see if she'd believe it." "Did she?" I asked, unable to suppress a small smile. "Completely," Grace said. I almost felt bad correcting her afterward. Despite the occasional humor found in these situations, I remained aware of the more serious implications developing beneath the surface. Commander Frost had mentioned, during one of our meetings, that reports of the incident had begun circulating through official channels well beyond our training station, reaching officers and administrators throughout the wider Coalition Fleet command structure. "Several senior commanders have requested copies of the sensor recording," Frost told me during what would become our final scheduled check-in before the Academy's upcoming evaluation period. "Not out of any disciplinary concern regarding your actions, but out of genuine interest in reassessing certain assumptions about human capability within combat training programs." "That seems like a significant reaction to one incident," I said. "Perhaps," Frost said, "though I suspect this incident simply crystallized questions that many officers had already been quietly asking themselves. Your species joined this coalition only recently, and many assumptions about your capabilities were formed based on limited information, often filtered through cultural biases these officers were not even fully aware they carried. What happened in that training hall provided clear, recorded evidence that directly challenged those assumptions." I found myself reflecting on those words long after our meeting concluded, walking slowly back toward my quarters, through corridors that felt somehow different now than they had just weeks earlier when I first arrived at this academy. The stares I received from other cadets no longer carried the same dismissive curiosity they once had. Something had shifted, not just in how others perceived me individually, but in how an entire species might be perceived going forward within this vast alliance of worlds. I still did not fully understand where this shift would ultimately lead, or what consequences, positive or negative, might follow from an incident that had originally started as nothing more than one instructor's attempt to humiliate a single cadet during a routine training evaluation. But as I settled into my bunk that night, staring up at the quiet metal ceiling of my small quarters, I found myself thinking less about Officer Venn and more about the countless other human cadets who would eventually follow the same path I had taken into this academy, wondering what kind of reception awaited them because of what had happened here. 3 weeks after the incident, I was called once again to the administrative wing, though this time the summons carried none of the anxious uncertainty of my first visit to the review chamber. Commander Frost met me personally at the entrance, his expression carrying something I had not seen from him before, a kind of quiet satisfaction mixed with genuine curiosity about what he was about to share. "There's someone who wants to speak with you," he said as we walked together down the polished corridor. "Someone from considerably higher up the command structure than anyone you've met so far during your time here." "Should I be worried?" I asked, only half joking. "No," Frost said, allowing a small smile. though I suspect you should be prepared to answer some unusual questions. We arrived at a smaller conference room than the wide review chamber I remembered from before, this one containing only a single long table and a handful of chairs. Seated at the head of the table was an officer I did not immediately recognize, an older Veltharan with silver markings along her temples instead of the blue lines I had grown accustomed to seeing on Vin, indicating, as I would later learn, considerably more advanced age and correspondingly higher rank within Veltharan military tradition. "Cadet Cole," the officer said as I entered, her voice calm and measured in a way that immediately felt different from Ven's sharp, clipped tone. "Please, sit. I am Fleet Admiral Sova Wren. I oversee combat training standards across 17 academies throughout this sector of the Coalition." I sat carefully, doing my best to hide the nervous energy suddenly building in my chest at the realization of exactly how senior this officer's position actually was. "I have reviewed the recorded footage from your evaluation session several weeks ago," Admiral Wren continued, folding her hands together on the table in front of her, "along with the subsequent review board findings regarding Officer Ven's conduct." "I understand, Admiral," I said, uncertain what response she was looking for. "I did not summon you here regarding Officer Ven," Wren said, her tone remaining neutral. "Her situation has already been addressed through appropriate channels, and I understand she has since requested reassignment away from mixed species training duties, a request that has been granted." That piece of information settled something uneasy in my chest that I had not fully realized I was still carrying. Whatever resentment Ven might continue holding toward humans in general, or toward me specifically, she would no longer be positioned to act on those feelings within the training environment that had brought us into conflict in the first place. "I summoned you here," Wren continued, "because your recorded response to Officer Ven's strike has generated considerable discussion among senior combat instructors across multiple academies, discussion that extends well beyond the specific circumstances of that particular incident." "I'm not entirely sure I understand, Admiral," I said honestly. Wren studied me for a long moment before continuing. "Your species joined this coalition only 6 years ago. In that time, many of us have formed assumptions about human capability based on limited exposure, often filtered through incomplete information about your homeworld's history and traditions. Your response during that evaluation session demonstrated a level of controlled discipline that surprised many experienced instructors who had assumed such qualities took generations to develop within any species." I considered her words carefully, unsure how to respond to praise this significant coming from someone this senior within the Coalition's military structure. "The training I received wasn't unique to me specifically," I said finally. "Many humans study similar disciplines back on Earth. I simply happened to be the one standing in that training circle when the situation occurred." "A humble answer," Wren said, something that might have been approval flickering briefly across her expression, "though I suspect there is more to your particular training than simple chance placement. Regardless, this incident has prompted several academies within my sector to begin re-evaluating certain assumptions built into our current mixed species training curriculum. Your species may possess qualities that our existing programs have not been adequately designed to recognize or develop." "What does that mean, practically speaking?" I asked. "It means," Wren said, "that human cadets currently enrolled across this sector's academies will likely see increased attention paid toward understanding and incorporating aspects of your training traditions into broader coalition curriculum, rather than simply expecting your species to adapt entirely to existing frameworks developed by species with far longer military histories." I sat with that information for a long moment, trying to fully understand the scope of what she was describing. What had begun as a single tense exchange between one instructor and one cadet had apparently grown into something considerably larger, touching questions about how an entire species would be integrated into training systems used across multiple academies and, presumably, eventually across active fleet operations as well. "I never intended for any of this to happen," I said finally. "I was simply trying to avoid an unnecessary confrontation." "Perhaps," Wren said, "though sometimes the most significant changes begin exactly that way, Cadet. not through grand gestures or deliberate plans, but through small moments where someone simply responds with quiet competence to circumstances beyond their control. As our conversation concluded and I made my way back toward the training wing, I found myself reflecting on just how much had changed since that quiet morning weeks earlier when I had walked toward a training circle expecting nothing more than routine evaluation. What had happened in those 3 seconds had rippled outward far beyond anything I could have anticipated, touching questions of policy, perception, and integration that extended well past my own individual standing within this academy. That evening, as I made my way toward the dining hall, I encountered Threk Mulvar waiting near the entrance, apparently having anticipated my usual schedule. "I heard about your meeting with Admiral Wren," he said as I approached, his heavy features shifting into an expression of genuine curiosity. "News travels quickly within these corridors." "It seems to," I said, managing a tired smile. "What did she want?" Threk asked. I explained the conversation as best I could, watching Threk's expression shift through several stages of consideration as he processed the implications alongside me. "This is significant," he said finally, once I had finished explaining. "Among my people, we have a saying, a single stone thrown into still water creates ripples that reach shores far beyond where anyone expected them to travel." "That feels appropriate," I admitted. "Your species has been quietly proving itself since arriving in this coalition," Threk continued. "But proof requires witnesses willing to actually see what stands before them, rather than simply what they expected to find. Officer Venn, in her arrogance, provided exactly the kind of undeniable witness moment your species needed, even though I doubt that was ever her intention." I considered his words as we walked together toward the dining hall, joined shortly afterward by Liam, who had apparently also heard whispers of my meeting with the fleet admiral and arrived eager for details. "So what happens now?" Liam asked once I had finished recounting the conversation for him as well. "Are you suddenly some kind of official representative for human combat training across the entire coalition?" "I sincerely hope not," I said, laughing despite the exhaustion still lingering from the day's events. "I just want to finish my training and eventually serve on an actual ship crew, the same as everyone else here." "Somehow," Liam said, grinning, "I don't think things are going to stay quite that simple for you." He was right, though neither of us could have fully understood exactly how true that statement would prove to be over the following months. In the weeks that followed my meeting with Admiral Wren, I noticed gradual but steady changes throughout the Academy's approach toward human cadets. New instructors arrived, some specifically tasked with studying Earth's various combat and discipline traditions more seriously, seeking to understand rather than dismiss the training philosophies that had shaped cadets like myself long before we ever left our homeworld. Officer Venn, true to Admiral Wren's earlier statement, transferred away from mixed-species training duties entirely, reassigned instead to a position focused exclusively on Veltheron cadet development. I never spoke with her again directly during my remaining time at the Academy, though I occasionally caught distant glimpses of her moving through separate corridors, her posture as rigid and disciplined as ever, though carrying, I imagined, considerably less certainty about the assumptions she had once held so confidently. I did not feel satisfaction at her reassignment, nor did I feel guilt. What had happened between us had never truly been personal, not really. It had been a collision between old assumptions and new evidence, and evidence, ultimately, had proven stronger than assumption when both were placed clearly side by side in front of enough witnesses. As my training continued at the Academy, I found myself thinking less frequently about that single tense encounter and more about the broader path stretching ahead of me, one that now felt considerably different than it had during those first uncertain weeks after my arrival. Human cadets were no longer treated as a novel curiosity to be quietly tolerated. We had become something closer to genuine participants within this vast alliance of worlds, our contributions studied seriously rather than dismissed casually. Late one evening, several months after the incident that had started everything, I stood alone near one of the station's wide observation windows, looking out at the countless unfamiliar stars stretching endlessly beyond the safety of our rotating Academy home. I thought about Earth, distant and quiet, somewhere far behind those stars, about the family who had first encouraged my early training years before I ever imagined joining a program like this one. I thought about the countless other human cadets who would eventually follow this same path, walking through these same corridors, facing their own versions of unexpected challenges from instructors and cadets who might still carry old assumptions about what our species was capable of achieving. Whatever challenges awaited them, I hoped they would find, as I had, that quiet discipline and controlled competence could speak louder than any argument or protest ever could. Sometimes proving yourself did not require grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Sometimes it simply required standing calmly in a training circle, prepared to respond precisely when circumstances demanded nothing less. Behind me, I heard familiar footsteps approaching, and turned to find Liam and Threk walking together toward the observation window, apparently having sought me out after noticing my absence from our usual evening routine. "Admiral Wren's office sent a message earlier," Liam said as they reached me, his expression carrying a mixture of excitement and genuine surprise. "They're expanding the mixed species combat curriculum next semester. Guess whose training methods are being incorporated as part of the new program?" I stared at him for a long moment, processing the implications of what he had just shared. "They didn't," I said. "They did," Threk confirmed, his heavy features shifting into something resembling genuine amusement. "It seems, Cadet Cole, that your quiet 3 seconds in that training circle continue creating ripples reaching further than any of us initially expected." I turned back toward the observation window, looking out once more at the endless stars stretching beyond our small academy station, and found myself smiling, despite the uncertainty still surrounding exactly where this unexpected path might eventually lead. Whatever came next, whatever challenges or opportunities followed from everything that had happened since that single tense morning weeks earlier, I understood now that this was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that extended far beyond my own individual training, touching the future of an entire species finding its place among the stars. And somewhere across the vast reaches of Coalition space, I suspected, other officers and commanders were already beginning to ask themselves the same question that had first prompted Admiral Wren to summon me into that quiet conference room weeks earlier. What else had they underestimated about the newest species to join their